Usually when we talk about a piece of fabric, we're really just talking about utility.
Right, yeah, like keeping warm.
Exactly. It's a shirt to keep you warm or, a curtain to block the sun. Maybe it's a rug to tie your room together.
Sure.
You pick a color, you weave the threads, and you honestly rarely give it a second thought. But the moment you take that exact same fabric, right, and you dye it with a specific geometric pattern, and then run it up a wooden pole,
Everything completely changes.
the physics of human emotion completely change. You step into the world of vexillology, which is the study of flags, for those who might not know, and suddenly that simple piece of colored cloth is no longer just, cotton or nylon. It becomes a literal lightning rod.
It fundamentally ceases to be an object, right? It becomes this physical manifestation of human identity. And what's really fascinating is how quickly that transformation happens. I mean, a flag can absorb generations of collective grief and pride, trauma, hope, all of it.
Yeah, people will swear allegiance to it.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They'll weep when it's lowered, and they will literally go to war over what it represents.
Which brings us to the story we are unpacking today. We are taking a deep dive into an incredible piece of historical research by John A. Hart, and it's all about the great Canadian flag debate of the 1960s.
Such a chaotic era.
Unbelievably chaotic. We're going to look at how a massive, agonizing national argument over a piece of cloth ended up completely rewiring the identity of an entire country. But we aren't just doing a history lesson today.
Well, not at all.
We're tackling a profound psychological question that honestly affects every single one of you listening, regardless of where you live in the world. And that question is, why do rapidly changing societies that are just desperately trying to hurl themselves into the modern future, why do they seem to have this profound, almost biological need to cling to historic symbols?
It's a massive paradox. It's the paradox of modernization. We tend to assume that progress requires a clean slate, but human psychology actually demands an anchor. And the Canadian experience in the 1960s is arguably the most perfect, globally relevant case study of this exact tension.
We're going to see how the political death of a national flag in the capital city of Ottawa led directly to its really bizarre resurrection just a few hours down the road in Toronto.
Right.
And we'll explore how a flag that was deemed, far too colonial and too old-fashioned for a sleek, modern 1960s Canada somehow found its way across the globe to fly over an American combat bunker in the middle of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that story is incredible. The journey of these symbols is entirely unpredictable because when a government tries to artificially engineer an identity, the public often reacts in ways that completely blindside the politicians.
So let's jump right into that environment. Because to understand why the province of Ontario adopted its own flag in 1965, we actually have to ignore Ontario for a moment.
We have to zoom out.
Exactly. We have to look at the national stage. If you were standing on a street corner in Canada in 1964, you were standing in a country undergoing a massive foundational identity crisis.
Yeah, you really have to picture the geopolitical and the social pressure cooker of the early 1960s. So the Canadian Prime Minister at the time is Lester B. Pearson.
Leading a liberal minority government.
Right, a minority government, which means everything is politically fragile. And Pearson is this fascinating figure. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize a few years earlier for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis. And during that crisis, he noticed something that deeply, deeply bothered him. The Canadian peacekeepers were flying the Canadian Red Ensign.
Which was the flag at the time.
Right. And that flag prominently featured the British Union Jack up in the corner. So the Egyptians actually objected to the Canadian presence because to them, that flag looked exactly like the flag of the British forces who had just invaded them.
I mean, that makes total sense because at a quick glance, from a distance across a desert, a red ensign with a Union Jack just looks like a British imperial flag.
Exactly. It was a massive operational liability. So Pearson comes into the prime ministership with this deeply held conviction that Canada absolutely needs a new, distinctive, universally recognizable national flag.
Something that says Canada and only Canada.
Yes. And he eventually throws his political weight behind what we now know as the red and white maple leaf. But the moment he formally proposes replacing the old Canadian Red Ensign, he ignites what historians literally call the Great Canadian Flag Debate. And, calling it a debate is almost too polite.
Right, it was a war.
It was a grueling, agonizing, 6-month-long political siege in Parliament.
Okay, so we need to dig into the why of it all. Why was the country so fractured over this?
Because it wasn't just a dispute over graphic design.
No, not at all. The 1960s in Canada was a decade of intense demographic upheaval. You have the Quiet Revolution exploding in the province of Quebec. And for those who aren't familiar with that, this was a rapid period of secularization and socio-political
A
awakening.
total societal shift.
Yeah, French Canadians were aggressively asserting their cultural and economic independence, and the federal government was terrified of Quebec separating from the country entirely.
And alongside that, you have the post-World War II immigration boom. Hundreds of thousands of new Canadians are arriving from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe, and elsewhere. These are people who have absolutely no historical, ethnic, or emotional connection to the British Empire, or the French colonial era for that matter.
So Pearson and his modernizing camp are looking at this incredibly fragile, fracturing national landscape.
Right.
They see an increasingly assertive Quebec, they see a diversifying population, and they see Canada's ties to the United Kingdom naturally fading as Britain's global empire dismantles. So they make a very logical calculation, right? A modern nation needs a modern, forward-looking symbol. We have to shed the colonial baggage if we want to survive the 20th century intact.
That is the ultimate modernist rationale. The belief that a neutral, history-free symbol, like a stylized botanical leaf, is the only way to unify a divided house. But to truly understand the sheer ferocity of the backlash, we have to look at the flag they were trying to put in the shredder. Because the Canadian Red Ensign was not just some temporary banner.
This is such a crucial point. It's so easy for modern audiences to look back and think, you know, well, it had a Union Jack on it, so it was just a symbol of colonial oppression. Good riddance.
Yeah, that's the modern assumption.
But for massive segments of the population in 1964, that wasn't what it meant at all. This flag had flown in various forms since 1868, right after the country confederated. It was officially approved to fly on Canadian merchant ships in 1892. And perhaps most importantly, it was the flag that was raised over the Parliament buildings in 1945 to celebrate the end of the Second World War.
We really need to linger on that for a second. Entire generations of Canadians fought and died under that specific flag at Vimy Ridge in World War I and on the beaches of Normandy in World War II. For the predominantly Anglophone demographic, the Red Ensign was not a symbol of their subservience to Britain.
It was the exact opposite.
It was the exact opposite. It was the physical symbol of their hard-won independence. It represented their unique journey from being a mere colonial outpost to becoming a fully sovereign nation that stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain on the world stage.
Wow. So when Pearson stands up in the House of Commons and suggests getting rid of it, that demographic doesn't see it as a sleek, modern upgrade.
Not at all.
They see it as a hostile erasure of their sacrifices. They feel like their grandfathers' graves are being paved over for a new corporate logo.
It's a profound psychological rupture. Both sides of this debate are operating from a place of deep, authentic love for their country. The modernizers genuinely believe a historic free symbol is the only way to prevent the country from tearing itself apart along ethnic and linguistic lines.
Right.
And the traditionalists, who were led by the former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, they genuinely believe that a nation that deliberately amputates its foundational symbols loses its soul.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy.
Yeah.
Because I think it helps ground the psychology. It's almost like a family moving into a sleek, ultra-modern smart home.
Okay, I like this.
One half of the family wants to throw out all the antique furniture because it doesn't match the new minimalist aesthetic. But the other half argues that without those antiques, the house just feels like a hotel. It doesn't feel like a home.
That is exactly the dynamic.
But let's break down the mechanics of how a society actually goes about replacing its soul, or its furniture. There is a brilliant historical theory by a scholar named Eric Hobsbawm called the invention of tradition. How does this apply to what Pearson was trying to do with the maple leaf?
Hobsbawm's theory is fascinating because it completely shatters our assumption that all traditions are ancient and organic. He argued that many of the traditions we think of as, ancient, were actually deliberately engineered by elites during times of rapid social transition.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about the Scottish tartan kilt. Much of what we consider the ancient clan tartans were actually codified and popularized in the 19th century to help create a cohesive Scottish identity within the British Empire.
Wait, really? So traditions can literally be manufactured?
Yes. You essentially hack the culture to create social cohesion. When a society undergoes a massive shift like industrialization, or in Canada's case, post-imperial diversification, the old symbols suddenly just don't map onto the new reality.
A narrative doesn't fit anymore.
Right. So the society has to invent entirely new traditions to make sense of the new world and bind the citizens together. Pearson viewed Canada in 1964 as exactly this kind of society in transition. He believed the invention of a new tradition, the maple leaf flag, was functionally necessary for the survival of the state.
But the problem with inventing a tradition from the top down is that you can't just mandate human emotion. You can pass a law saying, this new piece of cloth is your identity now.
Yeah.
But you can't force a World War II veteran to feel a lump in his throat when he looks at it.
And that is the massive friction Hobsbawm identifies. You are asking people to take all the emotional loyalty, the reverence, the identity that has grown organically around an old symbol over a century and instantly transfer it to a brand new engineered symbol.
It's like asking someone to instantly love a step-parent they just met.
Exactly. You cannot discard the old without causing immense psychological dislocation. People feel unmoored. They feel like foreigners in their own country.
And that feeling of being unmoored is exactly what was happening in Parliament. It was a 6-month marathon of filibusters, screaming matches, and just bitter, bitter newspaper editorials.
A total miss.
But here is where the story takes a brilliant turn. Because while Ottawa is tearing itself apart on the national stage, this intense, agonizing focus on identity suddenly makes the individual provinces look in the mirror.
Yes.
And they realize something incredibly embarrassing. Most of them don't actually have official provincial flags.
It's a wonderful historical irony. The absolute paralysis at the federal level creates this sudden, frantic rush at the provincial level.
It's wild to think about, but before the 1960s, Canadian provinces honestly couldn't care less about having their own flags. It wasn't just a Canadian quirk, right?
No, the history of state and provincial flags in North America is surprisingly pragmatic. A lot of American state flags didn't even exist until the 1893 Columbian World's Fair in Chicago.
Which is crazy.
The states suddenly realized they needed a piece of colorful fabric to hang over their exhibition pavilions to attract tourists, so they just hastily designed them.
Wait, so American state flags are basically 19th century tourist banners?
A lot of them, yeah.
Yeah.
The origin of these symbols is often far less romantic than we assume. Prior to this 1960s debate, only 2 Canadian provinces had distinctive official flags.
Right.
Nova Scotia had one, which was basically an anomaly born out of a 1625 Scottish coat of arms. And Quebec had adopted the fleur-de-lis in 1948, which, significantly, was a direct response to the federal government's previous failures to adopt a national flag that French Canadians felt represented them.
Makes sense.
But for everyone else, including the massive province of Ontario, a flag simply wasn't on the radar.
The early attempts to get Ontario a flag are honestly hilarious. It reads like a bureaucratic comedy. It starts in 1962. The National Capital Commission, a federal agency responsible for beautifying Ottawa, is setting up a garden display called the Garden of the Provinces. They want to fly banners for all 10 provinces around a fountain. So they reach out to the College of Arms in London to ask about heraldic protocol, and the College of Arms politely contacts Ontario's Agent General in London, a man named Jim Armstrong, to ask what flag Ontario would like to use.
And Armstrong's reaction is just the absolute epitome of mid-century bureaucratic indifference.
He essentially rolls his eyes at them. He writes back a letter stating that he's quite happy to just keep using the good old Union Jack of the Canadian Red Ensign.
Right, he doesn't care.
He literally tells the heraldry expert that the whole idea of designing a specific provincial flag seems, and I quote, rather silly and unnecessary. He just fundamentally does not see the point of wasting time on it.
But the pressure to create a flag doesn't go away. And what's truly revealing is where that pressure comes from. It doesn't come from grassroots patriots demanding a symbol to rally around. It comes from the tourism industry.
Here is where it gets really interesting. Because we tend to think of flags as these sacred, ancient relics born from battle or revolution. But the source text shows that Ontario's early flag momentum was basically a 1960s tourism branding exercise. It challenges our whole romantic notion of how state symbols are born.
It absolutely does. In 1963, a prominent businessman named Bill Cranston, who chaired the Provincial Tourist Industry Committee, decides that Ontario needs a flag, not to define the soul of the province, but to boost hotel bookings and sell souvenirs.
Unbelievable.
Cranston teams up with a resort owner, and they hatch this incredibly cheeky plan. They decide to use the Ontario Hotel Association to quietly distribute unofficial Ontario banners to local schools, motels, and tourist traps. They
Wow.
figure it's a great PR stunt, and if they can just make the flag popular enough, they can force the government's hand to adopt it officially.
It's literally a stealth marketing campaign. They were
Mhm.
trying to bootstrap a provincial identity just to get people to visit lakes in the summer. But the provincial government catches wind of this, specifically the Deputy Minister for Travel and Publicity,
Hmm.
and they absolutely panic. They shut Cranston's project down immediately.
And why the panic? Because context is everything. It's 1963. The national flag debate in Ottawa is just starting to bubble up and get toxic. The Ontario provincial government is terrified of accidentally stepping on a political landmine.
Oh, of course.
They know that if they officially adopt a provincial flag right at that exact moment, the federal politicians and the press will interpret it as Ontario taking a definitive stance on the national issue. They want to stay invisible.
But staying invisible was becoming impossible because the nature of provincial governments was fundamentally changing at that time.
Exactly. The 1960s marked an era of explosive expansion for provincial power in Canada. Prior to this, the federal government handled all the big, visible projects. But suddenly, the provinces are taking over the daily lives of citizens.
Right.
They are building massive new university systems. They are expanding early forms of Medicare. They are paving massive highway networks. The provincial government is suddenly a highly visible, incredibly expensive entity. And when you are expanding your services and taxing your citizens that heavily, you need a corporate identity.
You need a brand. It's like a massive corporation realizing they don't have a logo.
Precisely. Ontario was already in the process of rolling out a stylized geometric trillium logo for government documents.
The trillium being the provincial flower.
Right. And a few years later, they would commission a spectacularly catchy, Oscar-winning promotional film and anthem called A Place to Stand, A Place to Grow for the Expo 67 World Fair. They were consciously building a modern marketing portfolio.
Wow.
And within that context, a flag is the ultimate original branding tool. So the desire for an Ontario flag was primarily driven by this modern, bureaucratic need for branding. But the exact timing of it and the specific controversial design they eventually chose were dictated entirely by the chaos unfolding in Ottawa.
So let's fast forward to the climax of that chaos. It's December 1964. The final bitter votes are happening in the House of Commons. The atmosphere is toxic. The modernizers, led by Pearson, finally have the votes to push the new red and white maple leaf through, but the traditionalists attempt one final, desperate legislative maneuver.
Yeah, the Conservative opposition introduces an amendment. They realize they've lost the war over the primary national flag, so they ask for a compromise. They propose keeping the Canadian Red Ensign as a secondary official flag,
Right?
a flag that would specifically symbolize Canada's ongoing ties to the Crown and its history within the Commonwealth.
It was a plea for a dual flag system.
Yeah.
They were essentially saying, fine, give us the modern, sleek, botanical logo for the international stage,
Right.
but please, don't completely execute the old flag. Let us keep it in some official capacity so we don't feel entirely erased.
And the government rejects the amendment. They vote it down.
Brutal.
The Canadian Red Ensign is officially, legally, and permanently orphaned. It has no formal place in the national framework whatsoever. And the psychological toll of this rejection on a massive segment of the English-Canadian population is devastating. The newspapers that had championed the ensign don't just write disappointed editorials, they write eulogies.
Wow.
They speak of the flag as if a beloved family patriarch has just been assassinated by the state.
And right at that exact moment of peak emotional devastation, literally days after the national vote, Ontario's premier, John Robarts, steps up to the microphone.
Now, John Robarts was known as a very canny, incredibly cautious politician. His nickname was the chairman of the board. He had deliberately stayed out of the messy national flag debate up to this point.
Let the feds fight it out.
Exactly. But suddenly, he issues a stunning public statement. He announces that the government of Ontario intends to adopt its own official provincial flag, and the design he announces. It is essentially the exact same traditional red ensign that Ottawa just threw in the garbage, simply defaced with the Ontario provincial shield.
Okay, so what does this all mean for the everyday citizen? Robarts calls the Red Ensign un vieux copain, an old pal. Was this just a cynical political maneuver to capture the disgruntled conservative vote? Or did Robarts genuinely recognize a psychological need in the public that Ottawa had ignored?
What's fascinating here is how easy it is to assume it was purely a cynical vote grab. Taking the exact flag the federal government just banned and making it your provincial flag seems like an incredibly aggressive, calculated political middle finger to Ottawa.
It really does.
But the historical archives and Robarts' own correspondence reveal a much more nuanced reality. Robarts was actually a supporter of Pearson's new maple leaf flag.
Wait, really?
Yes, he wasn't an anti-nationalist, and he wasn't trying to undermine the federal government. He did this because he possessed a profound understanding of human governance. He recognized that true unity sometimes requires immense compromise.
But how does adopting a deeply divisive flag create unity?
Because you cannot mandate collective amnesia. You cannot force millions of people to simply forget the symbol they grew up revering. If you try, that repressed grief turns into deep, toxic resentment against the state. By adopting the Red Ensign provincially, Robarts essentially provided a massive emotional release valve for the tension that had built up in Ontario.
I see.
He was telling the populace, yes, we are moving forward as a united nation with the maple leaf, but as a province, we will hold on to your history for you. We will provide a safe harbor for your historical grief.
That is brilliant. But you can imagine trying to turn a highly contentious national symbol into a provincial brand overnight requires navigating a labyrinth of legal and historical red tape. And this brings us to one of my absolute favorite characters in this whole saga, a man named Allen B. Beddoe.
Allen B. Beddoe is a fascinating historical footnote. He was a prominent heraldic expert, a man who basically dedicated his life to the strict rules of coats of arms and vexillology, and ironically, he was actually the designer of the Pearson pennant.
Which was what, exactly?
It was the Prime Minister's original favored design for the national flag, which featured 3 blue maple leaves and blue border.
Oh, right, the one that got rejected.
Exactly. It had been mocked and ultimately rejected by the parliamentary committee in favor of the single red leaf design. So Beddoe has already had an incredibly rough year. His masterpiece was publicly rejected. And then he sees Premier Robarts on television announcing that Ontario is just going to slap a provincial shield on a red ensign.
And he loses it.
He absolutely loses his mind. He sits down and types out a deeply angry, unsolicited 8-page memo and sends it directly to the Premier of Ontario.
8 pages. Unsolicited.
Unsolicited.
Yeah.
And the tone of the memo is spectacular. It is the ultimate gatekeeping by a heraldic purist. He essentially tells the Premier, you cannot legally do this. He claims that a province does not have the authority to appropriate the British Union Jack and stick it on a flag.
He uses this amazingly condescending language. He tells the elected politicians that they're acting on raw emotion, that they possess an inaccurate knowledge of facts, and that they are not, and I love this quote, serious specialists in the field of heraldry.
Beddoe demands that if Ontario wants a flag, they need to adopt what is called an armorial banner.
Stop right there. What exactly is an armorial banner? Because we need to understand why Beddoe was so obsessed with it.
Good point. So in heraldry, a coat of arms is the core identity. An armorial banner is when you take the exact design from the shield of the coat of arms. In Ontario's case, that's the sprig of 3 golden maple leaves and the cross of St. George. And you stretch that design out to fill the entire rectangular shape of the flag.
So no Union Jack.
No Union Jack in the corner, no solid red background, just the shield design stretched out. Beddoe even drew up a mock design for them. And from a strict traditional European heraldic standpoint, Beddoe was technically right. That is the proper way to make a subnational flag.
But Beddoe is entirely missing the point. He fundamentally misunderstands the political and emotional imperative of what Premier Robarts is trying to achieve. Robarts doesn't care about the strict rules of 14th century heraldry.
No, of course not.
He isn't trying to create a neat, mathematically perfect design. He is trying to save a specific, deeply loved symbol, the Red Ensign, from extinction.
Exactly. An armorial banner of the Ontario Shield would have meant absolutely nothing to the grieving World War II veterans or the angry conservatives. It would have just been another new, unfamiliar design. The entire psychological power of the provincial flag rested on it looking almost exactly like the discarded national flag.
But Beddoe's angry memo still spooks the provincial government. They suddenly realize, wait, do we actually have the legal right to do this? And this triggers a frantic, almost comical scramble behind the scenes. They realize they need to get official royal assent from Queen Elizabeth II immediately before the heraldry purists or the federal politicians can derail the whole project.
The timeline of this scramble is incredible. The government introduces the legislation Bill 47 into the provincial parliament before the Governor-General in Ottawa has even formally submitted the request to the Queen in London.
Wow.
They are legislating on a prayer.
And to bypass Beddoe, They have to reach out to the absolute highest authority on the matter, a man named Sir Anthony Wagner, who holds the incredible title of Garter Principal King of Arms in London.
I know, it sounds like a title straight out of a fantasy novel.
Garter King of Arms.
Yeah.
It sounds like he should be guarding a drawbridge. What does this guy actually do?
He is essentially the senior authority on heraldry in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. He works out of the College of Arms. His job is to advise the Crown on coats of arms, genealogies, and flags. He is the ultimate referee.
And luckily for Ontario, Sir Anthony Wagner is far more pragmatic than Alan Beddoe. Wagner quickly reviews the situation, smooths things over with the palace, and sends back a note confirming that yes, actually, there is historical precedent for a province to use a defaced ensign, which just means an ensign with a badge or shield added to it.
Right.
He gives them the green light. The Queen grants royal assent, and the legal crisis is averted. They are flying by the seat of their pants to get this codified into law.
But clearing the legal hurdle in London doesn't clear the political hurdle back home in Toronto. Because when you adopt a flag that was born from a bitterly divisive national argument, you are inevitably importing that bitterness directly into your own provincial legislature.
This is where the debate over Bill 47 hits the floor of the Ontario Parliament in March 1965. And this is where we meet Elmer Sofa. Sofa was a Liberal member of provincial parliament representing the mining city of Sudbury. He was a flamboyant, highly educated lawyer, and he was known for being incredibly witty and devastating in debates.
Oh, yeah.
And he takes one look at this new provincial flag and delivers a blistering rhetorical masterclass against it.
Sofa refuses to accept Robarts' framing that this is an act of gentle reconciliation. He attacks the flag as a regressive reactionary symbol. He calls it a hand-me-down piece of cloth. But his most famous and damaging phrase is when he dubs it a flag of revenge.
A flag of revenge. That is a heavy accusation.
Sofa's core argument was that by deliberately adopting the exact flag that the federal government had just discarded, Ontario was consciously thumbing its nose at the new modern Canadian identity. He argued that instead of unifying the province, this flag was designed to perpetually remind everyone of the bitter, toxic fight they had just barely survived.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, he believed it anchored Ontario to the grievances of the past rather than the possibilities of the future.
But he didn't just attack the flag. He went after the government's entire nascent branding portfolio.
Yeah.
He mocked that new geometric Ontario Trillium logo we talked about earlier. He called it a cross-eyed owl and a tortured trillium.
Wow.
He was just having an absolute field day tearing apart the Premier's visual identity program.
But despite Sofa's incredible soaring rhetoric, the political reality on the ground was undeniable. Premier Robarts allowed his caucus a free vote on the flag, meaning they weren't whipped to vote along party lines. They could vote their conscience.
That's rare.
It is. And surprisingly, even the leaders of the opposition parties ultimately supported it. They read the room. They recognized that the broader public desperately wanted this compromise. The bill passed with overwhelming support. On a verbal ballot, there were only 2 dissenting voices in the entire legislature.
And so, the law is passed. The flag is official. On May 21st, 1965, the brand new yet very old flag of Ontario is scheduled to be raised at Queen's Park, the legislative building in Toronto. But passing a law is one thing. The physical reality of changing state symbols is a logistical nightmare.
Oh, a total nightmare.
It's like a messy divorce where the province gets custody of the dog. Suddenly, the province has to build a whole new doghouse. They have the legal decree, but they had absolutely none of the physical infrastructure required to actually fly the thing.
The physical rollout was pure chaos.
First of all, the province had to physically build a new place to put the flag. Protocol dictates that you cannot fly a provincial flag on the exact same pole as the national flag, and the new national maple leaf had already claimed the premier spot on the roof of the legislature. So the Ontario government had to spend $5,000, which was a substantial sum in 1965, to urgently erect a brand new, massive, 136-foot standalone flagpole on the front lawns of Queen's Park. Suddenly, government offices, schools, and courthouses all across the massive province are frantically hiring contractors to install secondary flagpoles.
And then there is the supply chain issue. You have to actually manufacture these flags.
Right. The local textile and flag manufacturers in Canada are already completely overwhelmed. They're operating around the clock, severely backlogged, trying to print millions of the new red and white national maple leaf flags for the entire country.
And now this?
And now suddenly the largest province dumps an order for thousands of provincial ensigns on them. And the ensign is a much more complex design. It requires a slower, multicolored printing process to get the Union Jack and the intricate provincial shield right. They literally cannot sew them fast enough.
It's a great reminder that political decisions have immediate, tangible, and often messy physical consequences in the real world. But as chaotic as the physical reality was, the emotional reality of the flag's adoption was profound.
Yeah.
John A. Hart, the author of our source material, dug deep into the provincial archives and uncovered the letters that poured into Premier Robarts' office from everyday citizens. These letters give you a direct, unfiltered window into the soul of the populace at that exact historical moment.
The letters are incredible. They capture the entire spectrum of the debate perfectly. You have prominent public figures writing in. Conn Smythe, the legendary owner of the Toronto Maple Leafs hockey team, and a veteran himself, writes a letter expressing a deep personal debt of gratitude to the Premier on behalf of his children and grandchildren for saving the ensign.
He viewed it as rescuing a piece of their heritage from the fire.
Exactly. But you also see the fierce opposition. Gordon Sinclair, a very famous, outspoken media personality of the era and a loud proponent of the new modern maple leaf, writes to the Premier to express his disgust. He says, "No colonial banner for Ontario, Chief. No red ensign."
And Robarts' response to Sinclair is a masterclass in political moderation. He writes back this beautifully diplomatic letter, essentially telling Sinclair, my friend, in a democracy, you have to learn to concede a little bit. You have to give when it's truly needed to keep the peace.
But the most moving piece of correspondence, the one that gives the article its title, comes from a retired minister living in the rural Muskoka region. He was a veteran of the First World War.
Yeah, this letter is so poignant.
He takes the time to write to the Premier, and he says, "One of the best things you did was give us the prettiest and most soulful flag in all Canada." He spells soulful with 2 L's. That's such a striking phrase, because for that specific veteran, that piece of fabric wasn't a corporate logo, and it wasn't a political bargaining chip. It contained his youth. It contained the memory of his comrades who didn't make it back from the trenches. It literally possessed a soul.
And this brings us back to that core psychological question we started with. Why do changing societies need these historic symbols? During the legislative debates, there was a brilliant observation made by a French-Canadian MPP named Fernand Guindon.
Oh, yes.
He argued that in times of rapid transition, a society must not destroy all its historic traditions in the name of progress. He said, and this is a crucial quote, "We must bridge the future with the past rather than only the past with the future."
Bridge the future with the past.
Yeah.
That is a beautiful way to articulate the mechanism of societal stability.
And the physical manifestation of that bridge was the visual that eventually emerged across Ontario. When you looked up at a government building, you saw the sleek, mathematically precise, distinctly modern red and white maple leaf flying high, representing the bold future of the nation.
Right.
And flying right alongside it was the complex, intricate, history-drenched red ensign, representing the roots and the sacrifices of the past. It was a visual, physical compromise.
But introducing a flag that looks almost identical to the old national flag inevitably caused massive public confusion. People didn't understand the nuance of the compromise right away. The text shares this hilarious anecdote about a university student working a summer job at a tourist border crossing in Fort Erie, right across from Buffalo, New York.
Oh, this story is great. American tourists would pull up to the border center, look up at the flagpole, and immediately start berating the student.
Right. The tourists would say, "Hey, why aren't you flying the new Canadian flag? Did you guys run out of money to update your flagpoles?" Because they saw the red ensign and assumed Ontario was just lagging behind the times.
It had no idea it was intentional.
The poor student had to spend his entire summer patiently explaining to hundreds of tourists his day that no, the country changed its flag, but the province adopted the old one, so technically this is the new provincial flag. It was an absolute headache for frontline workers.
And that confusion wasn't just limited to the border towns. It extended far beyond Canada. In fact, it reached all the way to the jungles of Southeast Asia, resulting in one of the most surreal and striking anecdotes in the entire historical record.
This story gave me chills. It's 1968, 3 years after the flag was adopted. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War. There's a young man named Sergeant David Zinkowicz. He's a Canadian from the steel town of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, but like thousands of other Canadians, he volunteered to serve with the United States military. He is a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, deployed in South Vietnam.
He's thousands of miles from home, fighting in one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century.
He writes a letter home to his mother in Sault Ste. Marie. He says, "Hey, Mom, I want a piece of home. Can you go buy the new Provincial flag and send it to me?" So his mother goes down to the local hardware store. She walks up to the counter and asks to buy the new Ontario flag. But the store owner makes a critical mistake. He reaches into his back inventory and accidentally sells her the old, discarded Canadian Red Ensign.
To be fair to the store owner, they look almost identical to the untrained eye. The only difference is the specific coat of arms on the right side of the flag.
Exactly. So she unknowingly mails the obsolete national flag to Vietnam.
Yeah.
See Lead Sinkowich receives it. And this young soldier takes this flag, a flag that the politicians and modernizers in Ottawa had explicitly deemed too old-fashioned, too colonial, and completely irrelevant to the modern world, and he runs it up a makeshift pole to fly defiantly over his combat bunker during the siege of Quai Son.
Quai Son was a horrifying, months-long artillery bombardment. And there, amidst the dust and the violence, flying above an American bunker, is the discarded emblem of the British Empire and the old Canadian state.
It perfectly illustrates the uncontrollable life that symbols have once they are released into the wild.
Oh.
A piece of fabric designed by 19th century bureaucrats to identify merchant ships, discarded by a 1960s government trying to rebrand a nation, somehow becomes a vital psychological anchor, a symbol of home and endurance for a 20-year-old soldier in a foreign jungle.
Yeah.
It proves that a government can change the official designation of a flag, but they cannot dictate what it means to the human heart.
It's a profound story. But it also forces us to transition from the history of how this flag came to be to the reality of why it has survived for over 6 decades. We are living in a society today that looks absolutely nothing like the Canada of 1965. The demographics have completely shifted.
Drastically.
So we have to ask the hard question. Why do the specific symbols on this flag, most notably the British Union Jack occupying the top left corner, continue to hold power today?
And this is where we have to address a very prevalent modern critique. If you go to a university campus today or read modern political commentary, there is a distinct assumption made about the Ontario flag. The modern critique argues that the adoption of the Red Ensign in 1965 was nothing more than a temporary reactionary act of protest by a very specific demographic: white, British-descended Anglophones who were angry about losing their cultural dominance.
And the logical conclusion of that modern critique is that as demographics inevitably change, as society becomes increasingly multicultural and diverse, these old colonial symbols must inherently become alienating and offensive, and therefore they must be erased and replaced with something neutral.
But the source material pushes back hard on that assumption. The historical record frames the adoption not as an act of racist exclusion, but as an essential civic emblem of reconciliation that allowed the province to move forward. But even if we accept that it was an act of reconciliation in 1965, the question remains.
Right.
Why does a symbol of the British Empire remain flying over provincial buildings in one of the most hyper-diverse, multicultural places on Earth in the year 2026? Does it actually alienate new citizens?
To answer that, the author of the text does something very smart. He pulls the lens back and looks at global comparisons to demonstrate the transcultural appeal of the Union Jack. It turns out this is not just a quirky Ontario phenomenon. The retention of historical symbols and changing demographics is a global pattern.
The text brings up the New Zealand referendum of 2016, which is a perfect parallel. New Zealand had a massive national debate. They asked the entire population, do you want to keep our current national flag, which features the Union Jack prominently, or do you want to change it to a brand new, modern design featuring the silver fern?
The silver fern being a distinctly local geographic symbol, very similar to the Canadian maple leaf. Now, heading into that referendum, the conventional political wisdom among commentators was unanimous.
Everyone assumed it was a done deal.
Everyone assumed that the younger generations, the indigenous Maori population, and the newer non-European immigrant communities would vote overwhelmingly to scrap the Union Jack. It was viewed as a relic of white colonialism.
But the actual voting data revealed the exact opposite. The text points out that when the ballots were counted, the polling showed that support for keeping the historic flag with the Union Jack was actually proportionately stronger among non-European ethnicities and younger age cohorts than it was among older white voters.
It completely shattered the simplistic narrative that non-white demographics inherently despise historical European symbols, and the author points to other global examples to reinforce this. Look at Hawaii.
Oh, right.
Hawaii is a U.S. state, not a British colony, yet it proudly retains the Union Jack in the canton of its state flag.
Hmm.
Look at Fiji, an independent republic in the South Pacific with a massive South Asian population. They also retain the Union Jack on their national flag.
It challenges the modern listener, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We assume changing demographics mean a mandatory erasure of old symbols. What is the psychological mechanism at play there? Because if you were a new immigrant to New Zealand or Canada, your ancestors weren't British. You have no blood tied to that symbol.
The mechanism is that over time, the meaning of a symbol evolves and dilutes from its original literal context.
Hmm.
For many communities, the Union Jack sheds its immediate identity as a symbol of the British Empire and transforms into a localized symbol of institutional stability.
Stability is the key word.
Exactly. It represents continuity, the rule of law, the parliamentary system, and the specific historical journey that created the stable society they chose to immigrate to. In places like New Zealand, it also represents the specific foundational treaties signed between the Crown and Indigenous peoples.
This really challenges our modern assumptions. We tend to operate on this very modern belief that changing demographics demand a constant mandatory erasure of old symbols so that new people feel perfectly represented. We think we have to constantly redecorate the house so the guests feel welcome.
But the text suggests something far more complex. It suggests that these historical symbols can actually be a source of strength and continuity, providing a deep historic bedrock for new citizens to stand on, rather than constantly shifting sand.
That makes a lot of sense. There is a profound psychological comfort in joining a society that is anchored, a society that knows exactly where it came from and isn't afraid of its own shadow. Even if your personal ancestors didn't arrive on those specific colonial ships, you are integrating into the stable institutions those ships brought.
The old symbols provide a landscape of continuity, rather than a landscape of constantly shifting sand, where the visual identity of the state changes every time the political wind blows. People want to join a story that is already in progress, not one that is constantly being erased and rewritten.
And this brings us to a brilliant, almost philosophical theory mentioned in the text by the Canadian historian Arthur Lower. In 1968, Lower wrote an essay where he made the provocative claim that Ontario does not exist.
Ontario does not exist. It's a great hook for an essay. What he meant by that was that Ontario is so massive, so geographically diverse, and historically so closely aligned with the power and the goals of the federal government that it lacks a distinct, separate, collective will.
Right. If you look at a province like Quebec or an island like Newfoundland, they have incredibly distinct subnational identities, unique dialects, unique cultures. But Lower argued that Ontarians historically didn't think of themselves as Ontarians. They just thought of themselves as the default Canadians.
Exactly. Ontario's identity was practically indistinguishable from the national identity. They viewed the history of Canada as simply the history of Ontario written large.
Ah. So that explains the flag. Because Ontario's identity was so fused with the nation, it ironically makes perfect sense that when they finally needed to choose a specific provincial flag, they simply reached into the federal garbage bin and pulled out the discarded national flag.
Precisely. To them, it wasn't a hand-me-down, it was their symbol. They took the old national emblem because it was the perfect expression of a province that viewed its own history as synonymous with the history of the entire nation. By adopting the Red Ensign, Ontario was essentially declaring, we are the keepers of the original Canadian flame.
And that profound historical stubbornness has resulted in the incredible visual reality of modern Canada. Imagine walking down a bustling, hyper-diverse street in downtown Toronto or Ottawa today. What do you see when you look up at a government building?
You see a masterful, evolved, dual identity system.
Yes. You see the sleek, mathematically precise red and white maple leaf flying at the very top. It is universally beloved, recognized instantly around the globe as modern Canada.
And right next to it, or slightly below it on a provincial pole, you see the complex, history-drenched, unapologetically colonial Ontario Red Ensign. And importantly, depending on where you are, you might also increasingly see the green and white Franco-Ontarian flag, which the province also officially adopted to recognize the deep historic roots of its French-speaking community.
They are all flying together harmoniously. It demonstrates that a society doesn't actually have to choose between its future and its past. It's a false dichotomy.
This raises an important question, though, about how these symbols function together. The maple leaf and the red ensign serve two completely different but entirely complementary psychological purposes today. The maple leaf is the ideal dynamic, forward-looking emblem.
Because it is a simple botanical symbol.
Right. It is relatively unburdened by ancient history, which makes it an incredibly welcoming canopy for a rapidly changing, diverse nation.
But the provincial flags, whether it's Quebec's fleur-de-lis or Nova Scotia's Scottish cross or Ontario's red ensign, they act as the roots of the tree. They hold the historical DNA. They tell the messy, complicated, undeniably true story of how the society actually began. A tree needs both the canopy to catch the new sunlight and the deep roots to keep it from blowing over in a storm.
That is the perfect way to summarize it. What we've seen today is that the great Canadian flag debate of the 1960s wasn't just a trivial argument over graphic design. It was a profound psychological crisis.
The country was trying to figure out how to grow up without abandoning its parents.
Exactly. And through trial and error, through a lot of political screaming, and through the surprisingly empathetic compromise of a provincial premier, the society realized it needed the modern maple leaf to look forward, but it absolutely required the historic red ensign to stay grounded.
It is a lasting testament to the fact that you cannot simply legislate away the emotional attachments of a population. You have to honor where people came from, even as you forcefully drag them into the future.
Absolutely.
And so, I want to turn this back to you listening to this deep dive right now. We've talked a lot about nations and provinces, but this psychology applies to the micro level of our own lives too. Think about the symbols in your own world. Look around at the flags of your own state or city. Look at the heirlooms in your own family.
Yeah, the personal anchors.
Right. When massive, overwhelming changes happen in your life, when you move to a new city or start a new career or blend a new family, what is the vieux copain, the old pal that you stubbornly keep around? What is the antique piece of furniture or the battered old photograph that you refuse to throw away because it serves as the physical anchor reminding you of exactly who you are and where you came from?
That is the crucial question. And as you think about the anchors in your own life, consider this final, somewhat provocative historical thought.
Let's hear it.
Today, in 2026, we view the Canadian maple leaf as a universally beloved, perfect modern design, and we view the red ensign as the old, stubborn, traditionalist artifact. But flags are nothing more than mirrors reflecting the societies that fly them. 50 or 100 years from now, as Canada and its provinces continue to evolve and change in ways we can't even comprehend today, will the maple leaf eventually be viewed as the stubborn, traditionalist symbol?
Oh, wow.
Will a brand new generation of modernizers demand a new flag to represent their reality? History suggests that the debate over who we are and what colors we wear to prove it to the world is never truly over.
That is a fascinating thought to leave on, the idea that today's sleek avant-garde is destined to become tomorrow's antique. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden history, the political chaos, and the deep psychology of the things flying right above our heads. Until next time, keep looking up and keep asking the hard questions about the history around you.